Good morning, I'm Adam Sexton. When Jay Rouet won his first term leading the city of Manchester in 2023, it was viewed as something of an upset. Earlier this month, he won a second term, and it wasn't close. He took almost 60% of the vote. Mayor Rouet joins us this morning to discuss that victory and what's ahead in the next 2 years. Mr. Mayor, thanks for being here.
Hey, it's great to be with you, Adam. Thank you.
And congratulations, of course.
Thank you very much. I appreciate it.
So what was the message you took from the Queen City voters in this decisive win?
Sure. So I think people appreciated the fact that we have made some progress over the last 2 years, but fully recognizing that we have a lot more work to do. But I think also that there was an appreciation that we were able to work together. I mean, you had a board that was evenly split, but I can count on one hand the amount of times that I actually had to break a tie as mayor, because I think overall people just want us to get stuff done. You know, not everything has to be a partisan issue. We can work together, we can work across the lines, and we can get things accomplished for the city.
Democrats were looking for any silver lining they could get in this, and I think one of the messages on social media that I saw was like, hey, our candidate filed at the last second, she didn't campaign a lot and still ended up with about 40%. Okay, but do you think, though, is there a message in there that also that you're still riding a bit of a bucking bronco in a city like this as a Republican?
Well, I mean, I'll leave the analysis up to you, the expert here. But I think, you know, as I was knocking on doors, as I was talking to people in the downtown, when my wife and I would go out to eat, I think people genuinely viewed that we had made progress over that 2-year period. Crime had fallen by 15%. Overdoses are at their lowest recorded numbers since they started keeping track of that data. Housing is popping up everywhere. We made some good progress. That we have the zoning rewrite coming up on the 16th. We did a compensation study for our city employees. We got an awful lot done in that first 2 years, and I think people were appreciative of that, and I want to see that progress continue.
The conservative Republican base has had its issues with you as well. Obviously, Alderman Joe Kelly Levasseur, he did not win re-election. How do you respond, though, when you run into a fellow Republican on the street and they say, hey, Jay, I thought you were going to be more conservative in this office?
My job is to represent the entire city of Manchester, and that's Republicans, Democrats, and independents. And I think, you know, one of the things that as mayor is you have to solve problems, and you have to work with everybody to get things accomplished. So sometimes that means maybe you're going to upset a group of individuals over here. Sometimes it's over here. But at the end of the day, our whole emphasis, our whole point of being, the whole reason why we get elected is to serve the entirety of the city of Manchester. And that's going to continue to be my focus.
One of the other attack lines, if you want to call it, the Democrats used against you in this election, they were saying, well, we all know Jay Rouet is going to run for higher office in the future. You know, as if their own mayor didn't just do that herself. But, you know, you've been pretty firm about not wanting to climb the ladder to D.C. But do you see yourself perhaps running for an office like governor in the future when Governor Ayotte moves on?
I love my job. Every single day, we can make a difference in the city of Manchester. The greatest thing about being at the local level here as mayor is I can pick up a phone call. I can pick up the phone and I can make a call and I can say, hey, we got to get something done on this. I can call several aldermen and we can bring something up in 2 weeks at the next meeting and we can make a difference. I have the best job in the world and I'm not looking forward to doing anything else.
What's your outlook on this new board in terms of working relationships and the kind of aldermen you have coming in?
I'm very excited about it. I mean, we've already started. Right after the election, I reached out to all of the incoming Board of School Committee members and all of the incoming aldermen, and we're sitting down and we're doing one-on-one meetings right now, and I'm going to work with them to put together that list of priorities that we want to implement next year. Some of them I've already put into the inaugural address that I'll give when I get sworn in on the 6th. But the whole effort, the whole impetus here is that we've got to work together to push this city forward.
Let's talk about the issues. A big one right now that's looming for next year is this continuum of care funding. It's kind of a clunky term for basically a lot of funding that helps the homeless, and some of that is permanent supportive housing. One of the changes that HUD and the Trump administration wants to implement is in the matrix of that funding, they want to reduce how much can be spent on permanent supportive housing. Potentially, a lot of people could lose their housing right here in Manchester, too. What's the impact to the city if that goes forward?
So I work every single day with our community partners here, the nonprofits in the city that are doing this work on homelessness, on street outreach, on treatment, transitional housing, sheltering, all of it. And these changes would have a significant impact here on the city of Manchester. I'm not supportive of them. I've spoken out with the HUD individual here in the state of New Hampshire. I think there is time on this to help make a difference. Ultimately, I think there's an opportunity here, though, that if we do want to make changes, and if the administration is looking to make changes, I'd be the first one to sign up and say, hey, come to us. Let's work together. Let's find out how we can make this program better. If they're seeing things that we're not, I do think there are some good things in it with transitional housing, with street outreach, with an emphasis on mental health and fixing those underlying drivers, which I've talked about since the first time I was on this stage in 2023. There are things in there that we can work on together that would be beneficial for people here in the city.
But philosophically, you don't disagree, though, that some permanent supportive housing is necessary for certain individuals?
100%. No, absolutely. Especially when we're talking about those that are aged and infirmed. I mean, I just spent the last 7 months with the Board of Aldermen trying to work to come up with a solution for the aged and infirm that we have in our 39 Beach Street shelter. And we're opening a new shelter next year specifically for those people that you're referencing that need that permanent supportive housing, because not everybody can go out and get a job if they have a significant handicap or they're elderly. We have a silver tsunami that is coming across the state and across the country with elderly that are in need of places to live.
One more question on this. The Alliance to End Homelessness estimates if these changes go through as proposed, it could be 88 beds lost here in Manchester. That seems like it would be a significant number of people potentially back out on the streets.
It absolutely would be. The 39 Beach Street shelter has 40 beds in it. Families in transition is 138. If we're talking about losing 88 supportive housing units, that would be substantial. And we don't have the shelter space to handle that. And we don't have the transitional living space to handle that. So we'd be looking at more individuals that are on our streets if this were to be implemented.
I'm interested in your perspective on a kind of national issue that a lot of people have been talking about. You're a prominent elected official. You also serve as an officer in the National Guard here in New Hampshire. What's your perspective on this refuse illegal orders sort of ordeal that has emerged that Congresswoman Goodlander is involved in?
So because of the dual role that I have in the National Guard as an officer, it's really not appropriate for me to comment on a matter like that. So I'll defer comment on that.
In terms of just the political side, you want to put on that political hat? I guess.
No, well, I mean, the dangerous part for me was I am an officer in the Army, and the individuals that I serve with or that potentially could serve under me if I were to be activated need to appreciate the fact that I don't make decisions based on anything that's political.
Let's ask this question in a different way then. You know, how weighty do you believe that responsibility is as an officer, that when you give an order to someone that you believe that it's legal and you're not going to put them in harm's way or in a bad situation legally either? Yeah,
I mean, part of my role and responsibility right now is I'm an OCS instructor, officer candidate school instructor, and we go over the law of armed conflict and we talk about illegal orders, we talk about what you have to follow, what your responsibility is as a soldier, regardless of your rank, whether you're an E1 private, buck private just coming out of basic, or you're a general. And so we routinely go over what an order looks like, how it's delivered, and your responsibility as a soldier to follow orders.
Yeah, it's interesting. I personally did not serve, but it's always interesting to learn how much of the discussion that is, particularly at the officer level. So maybe more on that at a later date.
Well, 2 years I got left in my
right.
stint, so
okay, we'll bring that question back there. So we'll probably be far afield at that point in terms of other issues. Let's talk about housing really quick. We had the mayor of Portsmouth in this seat, over the Thanksgiving holiday, and he was kind of saying, "Oh, we're doing more than Manchester on this issue."
Did he?
I want you to.
I'm going to have to give Mr. Declan a call.
Yeah, I'm just curious. So what's in queue for Manchester in terms of, obviously the cities have been doing the most on these, but in terms of housing, what's next?
So we have the zoning rewrite that's coming up on December 16th. That's when we'll take the final vote to ordain our new zoning rewrite. Only the third time we've done that in our city's 179-year history. But next year, once that takes effect in March of next year, certainly there'll be that implementation process. We want to ensure fidelity to that, the rewrite going forward. But there's a whole host of individual things that I would like to talk about, or that I will be talking about in my inaugural, that I would like to see implemented next year. There are 1,000 different municipalities across the country that have an affordable housing trust fund just like we do. But they have different processes. They have different ways of funding this. I'm sure you talk to developers all the time that will tell you the biggest thing that they run into is, yes, on the permitting side and the zoning side and the bureaucracy side, but it's on the funding. So are there ways that we could fund our affordable housing trust fund better? What does that formal process look like for folks to come and say, we're looking for $200,000 so we can make this pencil? I think we as a city can do that better. So I'm interested in working with the board, finding out what that looks like. Of course, you've covered this significantly. We have the YDC property in the north end of the city. The state is looking at bringing on a broker to look to sell that property. So we're going to be working hand in hand with the state on that as well. It's likely that They'll have that broker in place. My understanding is in the next year or so, which is then they're going to look at selling it. So we're going to have a seat at that table. We're going to want to look at what that's going to look like from a housing perspective. We have the Wilson School that's coming online as well. That's something, certainly I would love to see affordable housing, but more specifically to the Silver Tsunami comment that I made, I would love to see that be senior affordable housing as well. I go to the Cashin Center every month for coffee with the seniors here, and we talk about the affordability for seniors specifically. So those are three different things that I'm going to be looking at in the new year.
And before we wrap up here, I want to ask you, we talked about this in the debate, the sort of the education funding cut looming from the state level. How are you going to get around that or change that and make that work? Because I know you've talked about saying that, Manchester schools really can't endure the kind of cut that's on queue or in queue for Manchester right now.
So this is the important part about building those relationships at the state level. I think actually your first question to me in 2023 was how would I work with the governor? And I think what we've shown we have a great relationship with Governor Ayotte. She was fully supportive of the Manchester School District, and this time around with the budget, and that's where it's on us as a city to go to Concord and talk about what those damages or what the impact of that reduction would look like on the city of Manchester, and continue to make our case.
All right. Mayor Jay Roy, thanks for joining us here on Close Up, and congratulations on, again, the win in November.
Thank you, sir.
All right. And we'll be right back with the Democratic candidate for Congress in the 1st District, Carly Berrien. Stay with us.